The rainy streets of the city reflected the neon lights of towering skyscrapers as the clock ticked past 10 p.m. Dominic Sterling, the ruthless CEO of Sterling Industries, was known for his cold demeanor and dominating aura, always calculating and unyielding in business. Beneath that sharp exterior, however, lay something much more primal. Dominic was an alpha, born to lead and control. His company ruled the tech industry, and no one dared to challenge him, except his Omega secretary, Elijah Foster. Elijah had been working at Sterling Industries for the past 2 years, always at Dominic's side, an unassuming Omega on the outside. Elijah had been nothing but a thorn in Dominic's side, constantly challenging his decisions, questioning his methods, and pushing back with an intelligence that Dominic hated to admit he respected. Elijah was fearless in a world where Omegas were often treated as submissive or lesser. But Elijah didn't care for stereotypes. He fought for what he believed in. Dominic despised that attitude, though. Elijah's defiance went against everything he believed about the roles of alphas and omegas. Yet, he couldn't deny the pull he felt toward his irritatingly beautiful secretary. It made him reckless, made him lose control of himself in ways he hadn't experienced before. Elijah's scent would hit him at random moments, causing his inner alpha to stir in ways he hadn't allowed since becoming the boss. But Dominic was the boss. Elijah was beneath him. That was how it was supposed to be. This tension only increased after one particular board meeting when Elijah had openly defied him in front of the executives, suggesting a bold strategy that Dominic hadn't approved of. It took every ounce of control Dominic had not to react. He could feel the eyes of his colleagues on him as Elijah's cool voice laid out a plan that made too much sense for Dominic to dismiss, though the alpha in him wanted to reject it outright. The meeting ended with Dominic sharply agreeing to consider it. Later that evening, Dominic stood in his sleek office, his back to the floor-to-ceiling windows that showcased the city skyline. He was frustrated, pacing, when Elijah knocked and entered without waiting for permission, a signature move that only increased Dominic's irritation. "What is it now, Elijah?" Dominic's voice was low, his alpha pheromones thickening the air in the office. But Elijah was as unfazed as ever. "Just wanted to go over the logistics of my proposal for the expansion." Elijah's green eyes met Dominic's unflinchingly, his expression unreadable. There was something different about tonight, though. Maybe it was the storm brewing outside, or the long hours they'd been working together. But tonight, Dominic couldn't keep his desire at bay. The tension that had been simmering between them for months now bubbled to the surface, threatening to spill over. Elijah's scent was stronger tonight, richer. It was distracting. "You think you can just walk into my office and throw your ideas around, like you run this company?" Dominic's voice was dark, edging on dangerous, his alpha instincts surging forward as he stalked toward Elijah, who remained rooted in place, defiant. Elijah tilted his head slightly, his Omega nature instinctively making him appear more submissive. But his words remained as sharp as ever. "If you actually listen, you'll see that I'm right. You're just too stubborn to admit it." Dominic's hand slammed against the wall behind Elijah, pinning him in place, their faces inches apart. Elijah's breath caught, and for the first time, Dominic saw a flicker of something beneath that composed exterior. "Know your place, Omega," Dominic growled, though the heat between them was undeniable. His eyes flickered down to Elijah's lips, and he cursed himself for the weakness he felt in this moment. His alpha instincts battled with his rational mind, but desire won out. Elijah's scent hit him hard, sending Dominic into overdrive. The dynamic shifted in an instant as Elijah's usual defiance faltered, his body responding instinctively to Dominic's alpha dominance, even though his mind still fought back. "You don't scare me," Elijah whispered, though his voice was trembling slightly now. And it only drove Dominic further into the madness of his alpha rut. Before either of them could think, Dominic's mouth was on Elijah's, claiming him in a heated, desperate kiss. Elijah resisted at first, pushing against Dominic's broad chest, but the primal connection between them was too strong. His resistance melted as Dominic's hands gripped his waist, pulling him closer until there was no space between them. The kiss was both a battle and a surrender. Elijah clawed at Dominic's shirt, fisting the fabric as his omega instincts battled with his rational mind. His body betrayed him, arching into Dominic's touch as the scent of the alpha filled his senses. "You're mine," Dominic growled between kisses, his voice rough, possessive. His alpha pheromones filled the room, leaving Elijah dizzy, barely able to think. In a swift motion, Dominic locked the door to his office. Something shifted after that night. The tension between them didn't disappear. It intensified, becoming a burning flame that neither of them could fully control. Dominic became more protective, more possessive, but still as demanding as ever. Elijah hated that he was drawn to it, that his omega instincts responded to Dominic in ways he couldn't rationalize. Months passed, and their secret affair became an open secret in the office. Dominic was still ruthless and cold, but when it came to Elijah, there was a softness he only showed when they were alone. Elijah, on the other hand, maintained his defiance, his wit sharp as ever. But beneath the surface, their bond deepened. Then, one fateful day, Elijah's world shifted again. He was sitting at his desk, feeling unusually tired, when the wave of nausea hit him. At first, he brushed it off, but it didn't go away. Days passed, and the symptoms worsened. Elijah knew something was wrong, but it wasn't until he missed his heat cycle that the truth dawned on him. He was pregnant. The realization hit him like a ton of bricks. Elijah's hand shook as he stared down at the positive test. He was carrying Dominic's child, an alpha's child. He felt fear, anger, and uncertainty. How could he tell Dominic, the man who prided himself on control and power, the man who had never once mentioned wanting a family, was about to become a father? Elijah wasn't sure how he'd face him, but one thing was clear: their lives were about to change forever. Elijah's heart raced as he sat on the edge of his bed, the pregnancy test still clenched in his hand. He hadn't prepared for this, not even in the slightest. Their relationship had always been explosive, built on tension, desire, and mutual respect that neither would openly admit. But a child? That was a whole new dimension, one that Elijah wasn't sure either of them was ready for. For hours, he paced his small apartment, replaying every interaction he'd had with Dominic over the past months. The way Dominic looked at him, the possessiveness that came with their alpha-omega bond. But as powerful as Dominic was, Elijah knew that Dominic was a man who thrived on control. How would he handle something like this? Something neither of them had planned for. The next day at work, Elijah could barely focus. His mind was clouded with the weight of his secret. As the secretary to one of the most powerful men in the country, he was used to juggling 10 things at once. But this was beyond him. By noon, Elijah knew he needed to tell Dominic. But how? Foster, Dominic's deep voice broke through his thoughts, snapping him back to reality. He looked up to see Dominic standing in the doorway of his office, the alpha's tall, imposing figure casting a long shadow. "In my office. Now?" Elijah's stomach flipped. He swallowed the lump in his throat and followed Dominic into the spacious office, the door closing behind them with a soft click. Dominic's back was turned as he stood by the window, staring out at the city, his hands clasped behind his back. "Something's been off with you lately," Dominic said, his voice as sharp as ever. He didn't turn around, but his tone made it clear he wasn't in the mood for games. "You've been distracted." Elijah took a deep breath, steadying himself. "Now or never." "Dominic, I'm pregnant." The words seemed to hang in the air between them. For a moment, there was only silence. Elijah's heart pounded in his ears as he waited for Dominic's response. Slowly, Dominic turned around, his piercing blue eyes locked onto Elijah. And for the first time since Elijah had known him, Dominic looked genuinely stunned. "What did you say?" Dominic's voice was low, almost a growl, his alpha instincts flaring beneath the surface. Elijah held his ground, though his heart was racing. "I said I'm pregnant. With your child." Dominic's eyes darkened, and for a moment, Elijah wasn't sure what he was going to do. The air between them thickened with tension, the scent of Dominic's alpha pheromones growing stronger. Elijah braced himself for a wave of anger, or worse, rejection. But then, to his surprise, Dominic's face softened just for a second, before his usual stoic mask slid back into place. He stepped toward Elijah, his intense gaze never leaving him. "You're sure?" Dominic asked, his voice rough. But there was an edge of something else there too, something vulnerable. Elijah nodded. "I took the test this morning. It's positive." Dominic exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair as he processed the news. He was a man who always had a plan, always knew what to expect, and yet here he was, faced with something he couldn't control. Elijah could see the conflict in his eyes. "You're mine," Dominic said, his voice softer now, but no less intense. "This changes everything." Elijah swallowed hard, his emotions swirling. "It doesn't have to. I'm not asking you to." But Dominic cut him off, his hand coming up to cup Elijah's face, his thumb brushing gently along Elijah's cheek. "You think I'd let you go through this alone? Do you think I'd let anyone touch what's mine?" Elijah blinked, taken aback by the tenderness in Dominic's touch, the fierce possessiveness that Dominic had always shown in their private moments was now wrapped in something else, something deeper. "I never wanted this to happen like this," Elijah admitted, his voice shaking slightly. "I didn't plan it. I didn't expect it." Dominic's hand slipped to the back of Elijah's neck, pulling him closer until their foreheads touched. "Neither did I," he whispered, his breath warm against Elijah's skin. "But it's happening, and now we deal with it." For a moment, the world seemed to stop. Elijah leaned into Dominic's touch, feeling the bond between them strengthen, a bond that had always been there. As Dominic held him, the alpha's protective instincts flared to life. And Elijah could feel it. There was no going back now. He was carrying Dominic's child, and Dominic had already claimed him in more ways than one. Dominic had become more possessive, more irritable, and Elijah couldn't quite figure out why. They were working late one evening at the office when the cracks in Dominic's carefully composed demeanor finally started to show. Elijah was in his office, chatting with Jason, another colleague who worked in marketing. Jason was friendly, charming, and always had a way of making Elijah laugh. It was all harmless to Elijah, but Dominic, who was watching from his office across the floor, saw things differently. Jason leaned over Elijah's desk, laughing at something Elijah had said, his hand brushing Elijah's arm as he talked. Elijah, caught up in the conversation, didn't notice the subtle touch, but Dominic saw it. His jaw clenched as a wave of something sharp and bitter surged inside him. He knew he had no claim over Elijah, officially, at least, but that didn't stop the possessive streak from flaring up. The longer Dominic watched, the more his blood boiled. Jason's easy smiles and casual touches weren't sitting well with him at all. As far as he was concerned, Elijah was his, even if they hadn't yet crossed that line. By the time Jason left Elijah's office, Dominic had already made up his mind to address this unsettling feeling. He strode into Elijah's office, closing the door behind him with a bit more force than necessary. Elijah looked up, surprised at the sudden interruption. "Dominic?" Elijah asked, confused by the sharp look in Dominic's eyes. "Is everything okay?" Dominic's expression was hard, his gaze burning into Elijah. "What was that about?" he asked, his tone laced with barely concealed irritation. Elijah blinked, taken aback by the question. "What was what about?" "You and Jason," Dominic said, his voice dropping lower, more dangerous. "The way he was hovering around your desk like some lovesick puppy." Elijah stared at Dominic, a mix of shock and amusement crossing his features. "Jason, he's just a coworker, Dominic. We were talking about work." "Yeah, talking about work," Dominic repeated, clearly not buying it. He crossed the room in 2 swift steps, his presence looming over Elijah's desk. "That didn't look like just talking. He couldn't keep his hands off you." Elijah rolled his eyes, trying to keep his cool. "You're overreacting. Jason's friendly, that's all. There's nothing going on." But Dominic's jaw tightened, and Elijah could see the jealousy simmering just beneath the surface. "Friendly? He's crossing the line, Elijah. He has no business touching you like that." "Dominic," Elijah started, his tone softening as he realized how worked up Dominic was. Why do you even care? He's just a coworker. Dominic's eyes flashed with something raw and possessive. Because I don't like the way he looks at you. Like you're something he can just take. Elijah's heart skipped a beat at the intensity in Dominic's voice. He stood up from his desk, facing Dominic head-on. And, what about you? You act like you own me. The room seemed to shrink as the tension between them grew. The air thick with unspoken words and unresolved emotions. Dominic stepped closer, his towering frame almost pressing against Elijah's. You're not his to touch. Dominic growled, his voice low and dangerous. You're mine. Elijah's breath hitched at the possessiveness in Dominic's tone. He could feel the heat of Dominic's body so close to his own. In a swift, heated motion, Dominic's lips crashed against Elijah's. The kiss was anything but gentle. It was fierce, demanding, and possessive. As if Dominic was staking his claim right then and there. Elijah's hands flew to Dominic's chest, gripping the fabric of his shirt as he kissed him back just as fiercely. It was messy, desperate, and filled with a hunger neither of them had acknowledged until now. Dominic's hand moved from Elijah's wrist to his waist, pulling him closer, his grip tight, almost possessive. Elijah broke the kiss first, panting as he looked up at Dominic with wide eyes, his lips swollen from the intensity of the kiss. Dominic's eyes were dark, his chest rising and falling rapidly as he tried to regain control. You have no idea what I've been holding back, Elijah. Elijah's heart raced. He had always known Dominic was intense. But seeing him like this, so raw, so fiercely protective, was something else entirely. I'm not interested in Jason, Elijah said, his voice steady despite the way his pulse pounded in his ears. Dominic's expression softened for a moment. Good, he murmured, his voice rough with desire. The next few weeks passed in a blur of adjustments and new routines. Dominic's attitude toward Elijah shifted. He was more protective, more attentive, though still as demanding and ruthless in the office as ever. He began personally overseeing Elijah's schedule, making sure he wasn't overworked and insisting that he see the best doctors in the city. But while Dominic took control of Elijah's physical well-being, their emotional connection remained fraught. Dominic had never been good with emotions, and Elijah still wasn't sure what their relationship was supposed to be now. And he also couldn't stop thinking about the kiss. Were they together because of the baby? Or was there something more between them? One evening, as they sat in Dominic's penthouse after a long day, the city lights twinkling through the windows, Elijah finally worked up the courage to ask. What are we, Dominic? Elijah asked quietly, his hand resting on his small but growing bump. Are we just doing this because of the baby? Or is there more? Dominic looked at him, his expression unreadable for a moment. Then he sighed, running a hand through his dark hair. I'm not good at this, Elijah. You know that. I know, Elijah said softly. But I need to know where we stand. Dominic stood up and walked over to the window, his hands in his pockets. For a long time, he said nothing, staring out at the city below. Finally, he turned back to Elijah, his blue eyes serious. You drive me insane, Dominic admitted, his voice rough with emotion. You've always driven me insane. But I can't stop thinking about you. I can't stop wanting you. And now, with the baby, I don't know how to explain it. But you're mine, Elijah. You've always been mine. Elijah's heart clenched at Dominic's words, the raw honesty in his voice. For the first time, he saw Dominic not as the cold, calculating CEO, but as a man. An alpha who had been just as caught off guard by their bond as Elijah had. I don't know what the future holds, Dominic continued, stepping closer to Elijah. But I know I want you by my side. You and our child. Elijah's eyes filled with tears as he looked up at Dominic. For so long, they had been at odds, fighting their attraction and the complicated dynamics between them. But now, with a child on the way, they were finally facing their future together. And for the first time, Elijah felt like they might just make it, together. Elijah wiped the tears from his eyes, trying to hold onto the moment without letting his emotions overwhelm him. Dominic's words still echoed in his mind. It was the first time he had truly seen the vulnerability in the alpha. the rawness that lay beneath the cold and powerful exterior. He wasn't used to this side of Dominic, the side that wanted to protect, to care, to build something real with him. "Do you really mean that?" Elijah asked, his voice barely above a whisper. He wasn't sure if he was asking for reassurance or confirmation. Maybe both? Dominic knelt in front of him, resting his hands on either side of Elijah's knees. His gaze was unwavering, filled with an intensity that made Elijah's breath hitch. "Yes," Dominic said softly but firmly, his hand moving to rest on Elijah's small but growing belly. "I mean it. You and this baby. You're all that matters to me now." Elijah stared down at him, the weight of Dominic's words settling over him like a warm blanket. It was still hard to believe. Just a few months ago, they had been locked in a near-constant battle of wills, both too stubborn to admit how much they needed each other. Now, they were facing something much bigger than either of them had anticipated. "I know this hasn't been easy for you," Dominic continued, his thumb stroking gently across the fabric of Elijah's shirt, where it covered his bump. "I haven't made it easy for you, either. But that's going to change. I'm going to be here for you, for both of you, every step of the way." The tenderness in Dominic's voice was enough to bring fresh tears to Elijah's eyes. But this time, they were tears of relief. For the first time in weeks, he felt like he wasn't carrying this burden alone. Dominic wasn't just taking responsibility out of obligation. He genuinely cared. Elijah could feel it in the way Dominic looked at him, the way his touch lingered with a sense of protectiveness and love. Dominic rose to his feet again, leaning in to press a soft kiss to Elijah's forehead. Elijah closed his eyes, savoring the feeling of Dominic's lips against his skin, the warmth of his presence. He had never imagined that they would end up here, wrapped up in this complicated, beautiful mess of emotions and expectations. But here they were, and for the first time, Elijah allowed himself to believe that they could make this work. Their evenings had become a quiet routine. Dominic would return from work late, often bringing a fresh wave of energy into their now shared space. Elijah would be sitting on the couch or in bed, his hand resting on his growing belly, the pregnancy progressing faster than he had expected. They'd talk about the baby, the company, or sometimes nothing at all, just enjoying the silence and the comfort of each other's presence. One evening, as they lay in bed, Elijah shifted to find a more comfortable position. His belly was noticeably larger now, and the baby seemed to enjoy making itself known at the most inconvenient times. Dominic, half asleep, reached over and rested his hand on Elijah's bump, as if it were second nature now. "You okay?" Dominic murmured, his voice thick with sleep but laced with genuine concern. Elijah nodded, though he smiled at the way Dominic had become so attuned to his every movement. It was strange how someone who had once seemed so detached could become so invested, so present in moments like this. "The baby's been kicking a lot more lately," Elijah said softly. Placing his hand over Dominic's, he felt the baby's movements under their hands, a gentle but insistent reminder that their lives were about to change in a very real way. "Feels like they're trying to kick their way out." Dominic's eyes fluttered open, his expression softening as he felt the movements under his hand. For a moment, he was quiet, just watching Elijah, his gaze filled with something unspoken, an emotion that seemed almost foreign to the man who had built walls around himself for so long. "I can't believe it's happening," Dominic said after a while, his voice barely above a whisper. "A part of me still feels like this is all a dream." Elijah turned his head to look at Dominic, surprised by the vulnerability in his voice. "It's real," he whispered back. "We're going to be parents, Dominic." Dominic's hand tightened gently on Elijah's bump, his expression serious now. "I'll do whatever it takes to make sure both of you are safe. I won't let anything happen to you or the baby." There was that fierce protectiveness again, the one that Dominic couldn't seem to turn off when it came to Elijah. And while Elijah had once found it overwhelming, he now found comfort in it. Dominic wasn't just saying those words out of some sense of obligation, he meant them. "I know," Elijah said softly, "but it's not just about protection, Dominic. We're building a life together now. It's going to be messy, and things won't always go according to plan. We have to be ready for that. I know, Dominic admitted quietly. I'm trying, Elijah. I've never done this before, and it scares me. I'm not used to not having all the answers. Elijah smiled softly, his heart warming at Dominic's honesty. Neither am I, he said, shifting to lay his head on Dominic's chest. But we'll figure it out together. As Elijah's pregnancy progressed, Dominic's protectiveness only seemed to intensify. He hired extra security for both their home and Elijah's office, insisting that they should not take chances. At work, Dominic became even more meticulous, ensuring that Elijah wasn't overburdened with tasks and frequently sending him home early to rest. Elijah, for his part, appreciated the concern, but he couldn't help but feel a bit smothered at times. As independent as he was, it was hard to adjust to the constant hovering, especially from someone like Dominic, who was used to controlling. One evening, after another long day of Dominic insisting on managing every detail of Elijah's schedule, Elijah finally snapped. Dominic, you need to back off, Elijah said, his frustration spilling over as they sat at the dinner table. I appreciate that you care, but I'm not fragile. You don't have to micromanage everything I do. Dominic looked taken aback, as he confusingly said, I'm just trying to make sure you're okay, Elijah. You and the baby? I know, Elijah interrupted, his voice softer now but still firm. But you can't control everything. This is new for both of us, and we're both going to make mistakes. You need to trust me to take care of myself, too. Dominic's jaw tightened, and for a moment, Elijah thought he would argue. But then Dominic let out a slow breath, leaning back in his chair. You're right, he admitted, surprising Elijah. I've been overdoing it. Elijah smiled softly, grateful for Dominic's willingness to listen. I know you mean well, but we have to find a balance. Dominic nodded, his expression thoughtful. I'll try to ease up, he promised. But you have to tell me when I'm being too much? I will, Elijah said, reaching across the table to take Dominic's hand. We're learning as we go. But I trust you, Dominic. That simple admission seemed to take Dominic by surprise. He squeezed Elijah's hand, his gaze softening. Thank you, he said quietly. As the months continued to pass, Elijah's due date got closer. The nursery had been set up, and Dominic had spared no expense in making sure everything was perfect for their child's arrival. Elijah had to admit that despite his initial resistance to Dominic's overprotectiveness, it felt good to know that they were truly preparing for their future together. One evening, as they stood in the nursery, admiring the soft blue walls and the carefully arranged furniture, Dominic wrapped his arms around Elijah from behind, resting his chin on Elijah's shoulder. Do you think we're ready? Dominic asked softly, his breath warm against Elijah's ear. Elijah leaned back into Dominic's embrace, his hand resting on his belly. I don't know if anyone's ever really ready, he said honestly. But I think we're as close as we can be. Dominic hummed in agreement, his arms tightening around Elijah. I can't believe we're going to be parents. Elijah smiled, turning his head slightly to kiss Dominic's cheek. Neither can I, he whispered, but I'm glad we're doing it together. As they stood there, bathed in the soft light of the nursery, Elijah felt a sense of peace settle over him. Their journey had been anything but easy, but they had made it this far. One night, only 2 weeks away from the due date, Elijah was tossing and turning in bed, the pressure of the pregnancy making sleep nearly impossible. Dominic, who had been up late working in his office, entered the room and immediately noticed the tension radiating from Elijah. Can't sleep? Dominic asked quietly, crossing the room to sit on the edge of the bed beside him. Elijah groaned softly, shifting uncomfortably. No, the baby's doing somersaults again, and my back feels like it's been run over by a truck. Dominic's lips quirked into a small, sympathetic smile. Let me help. Without waiting for a response, he gently guided Elijah to turn on his side and began to rub slow, soothing circles on his lower back. The touch was both calming and grounding, and Elijah found himself exhaling a deep breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. You're really good at this, Elijah murmured, his eyes fluttering shut. Dominic chuckled softly. I'm learning. You're teaching me every day. Elijah smiled faintly, comforted by the warmth of Dominic's touch and the steadiness of his presence. But as the moments of quiet passed between them, Elijah couldn't help but voice a concern that had been lingering in the back of his mind for weeks. Dominic, he began hesitantly, not wanting to break the calm but needing to speak his mind. Are you scared? About the baby, I mean. Dominic paused for a moment, his hands stilling on Elijah's back. Elijah waited, holding his breath, unsure of what Dominic's answer might be. I'd be lying if I said I wasn't, Dominic admitted quietly, his voice uncharacteristically soft. It's the one thing I can't control. And that terrifies me? Elijah shifted, turning to look up at Dominic. There was a vulnerability in his eyes that Elijah had rarely seen. A rawness that made Elijah's heart ache for him. I know you're used to controlling everything, but this, being parents, it's not something we can control, Elijah said gently. But that doesn't mean we're not ready. We'll figure it out together? I trust you, Dominic. Dominic's gaze softened, his hand reaching out to brush a strand of hair away from Elijah's forehead. I trust you too, Elijah, he whispered. More than I've trusted anyone in my life. Elijah felt his chest tighten at those words. It wasn't often that Dominic let his guard down like this. But when he did, it always took Elijah by surprise. He had come to realize that beneath the cold, calculated exterior was a man who was capable of great depth, of great emotion even if he didn't always show it. I just don't want to fail you or the baby. You won't, Elijah said firmly, taking Dominic's hand and holding it against his belly. You won't, because we're in this together. And whatever happens, we'll handle it. We'll be okay? I love you, Elijah, Dominic whispered suddenly, the words slipping out before he could stop them. Elijah's breath caught in his throat, his eyes widening as he stared up at Dominic. It was the first time Dominic had said those words. For all the ways their relationship had grown and evolved, neither of them had spoken the words out loud. I love you too, Elijah whispered back, his voice thick with emotion. The weight of those words settled between them, binding them together in a way that felt irrevocable. Dominic leaned down, pressing a soft, lingering kiss to Elijah's lips. It wasn't rushed or filled with urgency, but rather a slow, deliberate expression of everything they had become to each other. When they finally pulled apart, their foreheads rested together, the world outside their small bubble seeming to fall away. I'm not going anywhere, Dominic said quietly. Not now, not ever. Elijah smiled, his heart swelling with a mixture of love and relief. Good, he whispered, because I need you. Dominic's hand caressed Elijah's cheek as he said, I need you too. More than you know. Dominic leaned closer, his hand sliding up Elijah's arm, his touch igniting a current of electricity between them. The connection was palpable, and as their faces drew nearer, the world outside seemed to fade away. Their lips met in a kiss that was both desperate and tender. Dominic's hands roamed over Elijah's body, caressing his curves with a newfound tenderness. The passion in their touch was fierce, driven by the raw emotion of their situation. As they broke apart, their breaths mingling, their eyes locked with an intensity that spoke volumes. I need you, Dominic, Elijah whispered, his voice trembling with emotion. I need to feel you. Dominic's eyes darkened with desire, his expression a mix of longing and determination. You have me, Elijah, completely. They moved together with a sense of urgency and intimacy, their bodies intertwining with a fervor that was both comforting and exhilarating. The intensity of their connection was heightened by the knowledge that their lives were about to change forever. As they made love, their movements were a blend of passion and tenderness, each touch and kiss a reminder of the love that bound them together. It was a moment of pure, unfiltered emotion, a testament to the strength of their bond and their readiness to face the future as a united front. When they finally lay together, their bodies entwined, the room was filled with a profound sense of calm. The intensity of their connection had created a space where they could simply be. Their love for each other and their child, a powerful force that would guide them through whatever lay ahead. Dominic's arms wrapped around Elijah, holding him close with a sense of protective devotion. We're going to be okay, Dominic murmured, his voice filled with a quiet certainty. "We'll face this together?" Elijah smiled, resting his head on Dominic's chest. "Yes, together, always." As they drifted into sleep, the intensity of their earlier moments settled into a deep, abiding connection. The love they shared was a powerful force, one that would see them through the challenges and joys of parenthood, binding them together in a way they had never imagined. And as they awaited the arrival of their baby, they knew that whatever the future held, they would face it with the same passion and intensity that had brought them to this moment. The next few days passed in a blur of final preparations and quiet anticipation. Elijah's due date was fast approaching, and the reality of impending fatherhood loomed large in both of their minds. The nursery was ready, their bags packed for the hospital, and yet Elijah still couldn't quite believe that in a matter of days, their lives would change forever. Then, in the early hours of a Friday morning, it happened. Elijah woke to a sharp, unfamiliar pain in his abdomen, followed by a rush of warmth between his legs. For a moment, he was disoriented, unsure of what was happening, but then the realization hit him like a freight train. His water had broken. "Dominic," Elijah gasped, reaching out to shake him awake. "It's time." Dominic shot up from the bed, his eyes wide with alarm as he registered Elijah's words. "Time, you mean?" "Yes," Elijah groaned, another wave of pain washing over him. "The baby's coming." Panic flashed across Dominic's face for a brief moment before he snapped into action. He grabbed their hospital bags, helped Elijah into more comfortable clothes, and called the car service to take them to the hospital. Despite the chaos and the urgency of the situation, Dominic remained calm, though Elijah could see the tension in his jaw, the way his hands shook slightly as he helped Elijah into the car. The ride to the hospital was a blur of contractions and labored breathing, with Dominic's voice a constant source of reassurance beside him. By the time they arrived, Elijah was in full labor, and the nurses wasted no time getting him settled into a delivery room. Hours passed in a haze of pain and exhaustion. Dominic stayed by Elijah's side through every contraction, every wave of discomfort. His hand never left Elijah's, and his voice remained steady, even as the weight of the moment bore down on both of them. "You're doing amazing," Dominic whispered, pressing a kiss to Elijah's forehead as another contraction hit. "I'm so proud of you." Elijah squeezed his hand, his breath coming in short, sharp gasps as the pain intensified. "I can't believe this is happening," he groaned. "We're almost there," Dominic murmured, his own voice strained with emotion. "Just a little longer." Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the cries of their newborn filled the room, and Elijah collapsed back against the bed, tears streaming down his face. The weight of the moment was overwhelming. Their baby was here, their child, the product of a love neither of them had expected. A nurse placed the baby in Elijah's arms, and Elijah stared down at the tiny, perfect face nestled against his chest. He couldn't stop the tears from falling as he looked up at Dominic, who was standing beside him, his own eyes glistening with emotion. "We did it," Elijah whispered, his voice breaking. Dominic leaned down, pressing a soft kiss to Elijah's lips before gazing down at their child. "We did," he said quietly, his voice filled with awe. "And they're perfect?" For a moment, the world seemed to stand still. It was just the three of them, Elijah, Dominic, and their newborn, wrapped in the quiet, overwhelming love that had brought them here. And in that moment, Elijah knew that no matter what challenges lay ahead, they would face them together, because they were a family now, and nothing could ever change that.